Greetings, friends. You are watching the Ruslan Belov channel. Today we will take a detailed look at the situation in the Ukrainian conflict zone as of January 6, 2026. A significant number of truly important events have taken place over the past day, so I suggest we move straight to the analysis. At the moment, the intensity of combat operations along the entire line of contact has noticeably decreased. Moreover, this reduction in activity is observed on both sides, both among Russian forces and Ukrainian formations. The reason for this is quite obvious and lies on the surface: extremely unfavorable weather conditions. For example, in the Kupansk direction, the snow cover has reached a depth of around 14 centimeters. Persistent snowfall and sub-zero temperatures have been ongoing for about 10 consecutive days. Under such conditions, the use of unmanned aerial vehicles becomes extremely difficult, and without drones it is essentially impossible to organize and conduct any full-scale offensive operations. In addition, there is another factor that must be taken into account. Tomorrow, the Russian Federation celebrates Orthodox Christmas. There is an unspoken tradition that the Russian side has adhered to for many years. During the Christmas holidays, the level of military activity is usually deliberately reduced to almost minimal levels. Of course, no official ceasefire is declared, and combat operations do not completely stop, but overall tension along the front traditionally decreases during such periods. At the same time, the attention of the global community and international media is currently focused not on the Ukrainian conflict at all. The main spotlight has shifted to events unfolding around the United States and its confrontation with a number of states, in particular Denmark, Greenland, and Venezuela. This is precisely where the main media interest is concentrated today. Throughout the day, a large number of high-profile statements were made, both by representatives of the Pentagon, including Peter Hegseth, and personally by Donald Trump. These statements primarily concerned Greenland, the role of the United Nations, and the overall configuration of international relations. Marco Rubio also publicly voiced his position. As a result, almost the entire information space is now focused on this particular part of the world, which also indirectly contributes to reduced attention to events along the front line in Ukraine. However, it should be understood that such a lull is temporary. The Christmas holidays will soon come to an end, weather conditions will gradually stabilize, and, most likely, within 5 to 6 days, the intensity of combat operations will increase again. At the moment, what is happening at the front resembles not large-scale offensive operations, but rather isolated firefights and localized engagements along the line of contact. Nevertheless, even under the conditions of such a positional pause, certain events have been recorded that have led to rather unexpected results. Therefore, let us move directly to a breakdown of the situation by directions. We will begin with the northern sectors of the front, namely the northeastern part of Chernihiv Oblast and the northern districts of Sumy Oblast. I would like to remind you that it is precisely this bridgehead that the Ukrainian side most actively uses to launch unmanned aerial vehicles toward the capital of the Russian Federation, the city of Moscow. It is from these territories that mass drone launches are regularly carried out, interceptions of which are reported by the Russian Ministry of Defense almost daily. However, over the past 24 hours, only a single piece of video evidence was published from this direction. These images show a drone strike on an explosive device planted under a bridge in the northern part of Sumy Oblast. This is an extremely important target from the standpoint of logistics and sabotage activity. The destruction of this object significantly limits the Ukrainian side's ability to move sabotage and reconnaissance groups, since the bridge is located directly in the border area. It is precisely from these areas that Ukrainian formations most often infiltrate saboteurs into the so-called Bryansk forest, as well as launch drones. Next, we move to the Kharkiv direction, from which some information is also coming in. Russian units continue offensive actions in the area of the settlement of Vovchansky Khutori. Only one video was published today from this sector of the front. These images show artillery strikes against positions of the armed forces of Ukraine already in the central part of Vovchansky Khutori, effectively within the settlement itself. These materials clearly demonstrate the nature of the assault operations currently being conducted in this area. After that, we move on to the Kupansk direction, This is perhaps one of the few directions, more precisely, one of only two, where, despite weather conditions, both sides continue to actively exchange strikes, conduct counterattacks, and carry out offensive actions. A very heavy meeting engagement is currently unfolding here. The combat map has once again undergone changes, and let us examine them in more detail by comparing the situation by dates. This is what the front line looked like just yesterday, on January 5, 2026. By the end of January 6, however, the map had already received quite significant adjustments. According to video materials published by the Russian side, Russian units are currently conducting active offensive operations not so much within the city of Kupansk itself, but further north, in the areas of the settlements of Kondrashenko, Kondrashevka, and Tishchenkivka. Today, changes in these areas were introduced once again. Just yesterday, a large part of these territories was marked as a grey zone. However, today visual confirmation has emerged that the Russian army is not only advancing, but is already present directly within the village of Tishchenkivka. The corresponding footage was published by pro-Russian sources. The video shows farm buildings, agricultural facilities, and various structures in the eastern part of the settlement. In addition, the footage clearly shows two Russian soldiers who are waving toward the camera while being on site. It is precisely on the basis of these materials that the map was adjusted, as the video indicates fairly confident control by the Russian side over this territory. At the same time, footage was also published from the southern part of Kondrashevka. These images show a series of FPV drone strikes against positions and equipment of the armed forces of Ukraine. Based on this video evidence, part of the previously marked grey zone was adjusted in favor of the Ukrainian side. And here we approach an extremely important point. If one carefully follows the entire history of the battles for Kupiansk and analyzes the previous stages, it becomes clear that what is effectively beginning now is already the fifth battle for this city. Moreover, the nature of what is happening largely repeats the scenario of the fourth stage. At that time, the Russian army managed to cross the Oskil River in the area of Dvorychna and west of Doroshivka, secure a bridgehead, and begin further advancement. From this line, the offensive developed toward Kondrashevka, then Tishchenkivka, then further toward Radkivka, Holubivka, and Myrn. After that, Russian units began advancing deeper into Kupiansk from the northwestern direction. However, subsequently, the Ukrainian side managed to organize a series of counterattacks, thanks to which it was able to almost completely restore control over the western part of Kupiansk, and possibly over the central areas and even partially over the eastern districts of the city. Now we are observing a similar picture. The Russian army is effectively once again beginning an offensive along the same routes. The main vector of movement is directed toward the R79 highway. At present, both fire control and physical control are being established over key supply routes. The Ukrainian side is already facing serious logistical difficulties. Over the course of the day, a large number of videos were published showing Russian FPV drone operators striking the main routes used by Ukrainian formations to transfer reinforcements toward Kupiansk. The footage shows two civilian vehicles being hit on the approaches to the city. A similar situation is recorded on the R79 highway. A Russian drone flies toward an armored vehicle, which is struck and most likely completely destroyed. In effect, logistics have once again come under heavy fire. The impression is that the Russian side deliberately allowed Ukrainian forces to bring additional units into the city, dig in, and establish defenses, after which it once again began methodically cutting off supply routes for the contingent trapped inside Kupiansk. The process is repeating almost exactly according to the same pattern, using the same tactics and along the same directions. At the same time, separate Russian units continue gradual advancement on the eastern bank of the Oskil River, something we have been discussing for several days now. At the same time, despite statements by the Russian Ministry of Defense and the command of the West Group of Forces, no convincing video evidence has yet been published, confirming that Russian forces have definitively secured a foothold in the settlement of Podoli and moved on to storm Kupiansk Uzlovyi. Nevertheless, it cannot be ruled out that such materials may appear in the near future. In addition, another active axis has opened up in the Kupiansk direction, the southeastern sector between the settlements of Kolesnikivka and Hlushkivka. Fairly high activity is being recorded here, and there is a sense that in addition to advances from the northwest and east, movement has also begun from the southeast toward Kupansk Uzlovyi and key crossings. We will closely monitor further developments in this area. I will repeat once again, the fifth battle for Kupansk is now unfolding, and it is possible that it may be the final one. High activity is also being noted in the Borova direction. However, it is precisely here that there are currently more questions than clear answers. Throughout December, the West Group of Forces and the Russian Ministry of Defense repeatedly reported advances in the areas of Bohuslavka and Latunivka, and even published some video materials. However, today a number of authoritative pro-Russian analysts are publishing maps according to which the territory between Novoplatonivka, Bohuslavka, Novokruhlivka, and the entire system of strongpoints is allegedly once again under firm control of the armed forces of Ukraine, as if the front line in this area had never changed at all. In this regard, a grey zone will likely be added in this sector in the near future, after which we will continue to observe how the situation develops further. At the same time, it is worth noting that over the past 24 hours, as never before, numerous pieces of footage have begun to appear directly from the territory of Bohuslavka itself. They clearly show fire control over the settlement and its strongpoints. Thus, if one relies on the assessments of a number of individual experts, this is precisely the configuration of the control zone that is currently forming in this sector of the front. However, if one analyzes the situation through the prism of FPV drone activity and the actions of Russian drone operators, it becomes obvious that a phased assault is in fact beginning directly from the direction of Borova. The volume of video materials documenting strikes in this area is extremely large, and all of them indicate that the strikes are already being delivered in close proximity to the settlement itself. Moreover, this concerns the use of assault drones, first and foremost FPV drones, which are employed for direct support of offensive actions. Next, we move on to the Lyman direction. Here, statements by certain pro-Ukrainian sources are being confirmed, according to which the Russian side has managed to establish full fire control over all key supply routes, including roads, bridges, as well as various embankments and engineering structures. However, the situation in this area may change. The reason is that today pro-Russian sources published a highly illustrative piece of video evidence. These images show an FPV drone operator patrolling the area of the Siversky Donets River. At a certain moment, the operator detects engineering equipment that is gradually constructing an embankment along the riverbank. A strike is promptly delivered against this equipment. This episode occurred at a specific point that we can see on the map. According to the video materials, by the time of the strike, the embankment was approximately 70% complete. In practical terms, only about 10 meters remained to be laid for the engineering structure to be fully completed. This means that at the present moment, the Ukrainian side is attempting to create a stable embankment in this sector, one that is extremely difficult to counter. Such structures are considered among the most resilient from a logistical standpoint. They cannot be effectively destroyed by drones. They are not pontoon bridges that can be quickly disabled by missile strikes, and even artillery fire often fails to produce the desired effect. Even when aviation munitions such as FAB bombs are used, the Ukrainian side, if it has sufficient resources, is capable of restoring such structures fairly quickly. For this reason, embankments of this type represent the most dangerous form of logistical solutions. In this context, a logical question arises. Why were such engineering works along the Siversky Donets River not carried out much earlier? The armed forces of Ukraine could and should have begun constructing them long before the current moment. It is possible that the reason lies in seasonal factors. The river's water level is currently at its lowest, which made it possible to implement such a project, at least for the winter phase of combat operations. It is difficult to state this with certainty. However, an analysis of the density of FPV drone activity suggests that this is far from being a single embankment. The Russian side, for its part, maintains full control over the surrounding territory and all logistical routes in this area. This includes, in particular, the settlements of Donetsk, Ryhorodok, and adjacent areas used for supply purposes. In addition, there is another zone where increased activity by FPV drone operators has been recorded, the area around the Sloviansk thermal power plant. Here, including based on satellite imagery, one can assume the presence of similar engineering structures being used for logistical purposes by the armed forces of Ukraine. Russian operators are also working very actively in this sector. Overall, a tactic is currently being implemented aimed at fully cutting off logistics and gradually wearing down Ukrainian forces involved in the defense of Lyman. Drones remain in the air almost around the clock, continuously monitoring the situation over the city and its surroundings. As soon as a vehicle appears that manages to pass the first layer of control near the Siversky Donets River, drones immediately engage directly over the city itself. Thus, the Russian side has chosen a highly interesting tactic, abandoning a frontal assault in favor of a strategy of attrition. The city is not being taken by a rapid offensive, but through systematic pressure, likely with the aim of preserving infrastructure, gradually pushing Ukrainian units out, and subsequently occupying the settlement. There are no active assault operations here, however the operational model being applied appears rather unconventional and, in some respects, unique when compared to previous offensive campaigns. Next, we move on to the Sloviansk direction. Here, a traditionally high level of combat activity persists, although minor adjustments have been recorded. In particular, the boundary of the grey zone northwest and north of the settlement of Sviatopokrovskoye was clarified. This is how the map was adjusted based on objective control materials. The number of geolocations coming from this direction speaks for itself. The Russian side is conducting regular strikes, methodically weakening the defensive positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. The situation west of Siversk largely mirrors the scenario previously implemented east of Siversk. First comes the systematic softening of defenses, followed by gradual advancement. Russian units are still located at a considerable distance from the Siversky Donets-Donbass Canal. However, progress is being recorded on an almost constant basis. Notably, today pro-Ukrainian sources, for the first time since the beginning of hostilities in the Sloviansk sector, officially acknowledged and confirmed information that Russian forces have managed to cross the Siversky Donets-Donbass Canal and enter the territory of the settlement of Novomarkova. If we turn to pro-Russian sources, the Russian Ministry of Defense reported back in April 2025 that Russian units had significantly improved their positions in this area. For this reason, the map had not been adjusted earlier. Now, however, we have received the first independent confirmation that offensive operations along the canal are indeed continuing, including on the Ukrainian side of the canal. The situation in the Kupansk Niveka sector remains extremely uncertain and is literally shrouded in the fog of war. Information is coming in very fragmentarily. At present, the main fighting is unfolding over control of the N32 highway junction, the railway line, and the railway station. According to some experts who claim to maintain direct contact with units on the ground, the Russian army has already established control over the railway station and continues to advance. In this regard, further map adjustments may occur in the near future. Nevertheless, overall, the front line in this sector has remained relatively stable for a fairly long period of time. At the same time, active offensive operations are developing in the Druzhkivka direction. Today, a minor adjustment was made between the settlements of Sofiivka and Novopavlivka. These changes were confirmed by reliable pro-Russian sources. The Russian army is indeed operating actively in this direction. However, the pace of the advance is not comparable to the tempo observed in October, November, and December of 2025. In the Doropilia sector of the front, the map has remained unchanged for several consecutive days. The main activity is concentrated along the Hryshyn-Belitsky line, which currently serves as a key defensive line for the armed forces of Ukraine. Regular strikes are being carried out against these positions. During this period, the Russian side appears to be setting itself the task of weakening this defensive line, so that once weather conditions stabilize, it can transition to a more dynamic and faster offensive with the aim of minimizing the distance to Doropilia as quickly as possible. Active offensive actions are also continuing in the Novopavlivka direction. This is one of the few sectors where stable rates of advancement are being maintained. Moreover, over the past 3 days, Various mapping services have recorded fairly significant changes. According to video materials, yesterday an adjustment was made between Novopavlivka and Filia. This area was reclassified from a grey zone to a red zone. Today, information has also emerged about the cutting off of the so-called pocket between Novopavlivka and Kharkiv. The Russian army is gradually leveling the front line along the Novopavlivka-Muravka axis, shortening distances, and overall there is a growing impression that the outcome regarding Novopavlivka is largely already predetermined. We now move on to the Zaporizhzhia sector of the front. Today, pro-Ukrainian cartographic services introduced important adjustments. According to their version of the map, most of Huliaipol continues to be designated as a grey zone. At the same time, video materials featuring flags and other visual confirmations are effectively being ignored. This is how they currently assess the situation. Meanwhile, we observe a significant expansion of the grey zone extending all the way to the settlement of Zheleznichne. A very large grey zone has been drawn in this sector today. According to pro-Ukrainian cartographers, everything located inside this pocket is currently classified as a grey zone, indicating intense meeting engagements for control of strongpoints. Based on the overall dynamics, there is a high probability that in the near future, some mapping services will recolor these territories in favor of the Russian Federation. In addition, another axis of advance has been identified northwest of Huliaipol, along forest belts near the corresponding complex and toward the northern outskirts of Zheleznichne, as well as in the direction of the settlement of Stara Ukrainka. FPV drone operators are actively working in this direction, controlling the movement of Ukrainian forces and effectively monitoring their presence in the area. Finally, extremely interesting information is coming from the western Zaporizhzhia sector. Today, a number of reliable pro-Russian cartographic services reported that Russian troops managed to finally break through the defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine in the area of the settlement of Nova Yakovlivka and secure positions on its southeastern outskirts. These adjustments are confirmed by several independent sources, and overall this sector is showing a high level of operational dynamics. This is how the map in this direction has evolved over the past several days. That concludes our briefing, dear friends. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel and leave your likes. All the best to you.